Hey, can I ask you something to follow up on something you just said before? The last Stampede matches.
If I still remember it, yes, you can.
The Junkyard Dog is Stagger Lee, and he returns to team with Bill Watts against the Midnight Express and Jim Cornette. You brought up his state during those matches and how he was coked up at times. How much of that did Watts understand? Was Watts hip to the idea that this guy's on drugs and he's messed up? Did Watts just think he's overweight and he's not into it anymore? I mean, we know now the way things were going, looking back. But in that moment in 1984, how aware was Bill Watts of the condition of the Junkyard Dog? And he would leave just a few months later. I mean, what was the relationship that you witnessed between Watts and the dog at that point in 84?
Well, in the ring, at one point, I saw him give Watts a tag where he just kind of, one of the Midnight Express, or maybe both of them, they'd had some kind of double knockout and they were both down. And Dog, instead of making any effort to make it a hot tag, just stood up and turned around and just stuck his hand out to Watts. And Watts looked at it like he'd offered him a fucking handful of cow shit and just bam, like motherfucker, and got in. And another time, he, in the finish or after, there was the afterbirth, Dog was supposed to slingshot me in over the top rope so that they could strip my clothes off and blah, blah, blah. And I'm standing there in the middle of the ring waiting for this big 280-pound guy to slingshot me in over the top rope. And he's standing by the turnbuckles and he's so blown up from the match that they had that he really didn't need to be that blown up from the match that he had, that he just stood there and just kind of grabbed the top rope and I'm 10 feet away and I've got to launch myself in. Watts knew by that point. Well, Grizzly Smith knew what was going on. I mean, he may not have known the exact quantity of substances that Dog was ingesting at that point in time, but he knew what he was doing because everybody in New Orleans kind of got the picture, as I believe you brought up on one of your shows. Didn't you have on somebody that from New Orleans or read an email?
Yeah. Professor Ricardo Coleman. Ricardo Coleman, who lived in the projects in New Orleans, and he said that in 83, word started going around that the Junkyard Dog was being spotted in the projects, and people figured out why he was there, and Pee Wee Anderson was with him as his bag man. And around that period of time was when he started gaining weight, and if you watch Mid-South Wrestling from that time period, on commentary, Watts is trying to cover for it. He's bulking up because he's facing all these big guys like the one-man gang in Kamala. He's picking up weight so that he'll have an equal advantage with these guys. He's trying to cover for it. But that was one of the big things I thought was interesting, was talking to someone from New Orleans, from the projects in New Orleans. I got a very different perspective on the rise and fall of Junkyard Dog than people from outside the territory who look back and go, oh, well, it's very simple. He got out of shape, he did drugs, and then he lost to Mr. Wrestling 2 and it was all over. Actually, it seems like it was starting to be over to a lot of those fans in 83, especially. It was a very small community. I mean, it was a lot of people, but word got around that Junkyard Dog was hanging out around the projects.
Well, and see, that's the thing when they started to lose, is the same thing happened when they started to hear the news about the Von Erich boys, the bad news, when it started getting out and it started to lose faith. Remember when they ran, well, and let me, first of all, what you said earlier, yes, Watts, to answer the question you asked before I go off in a different direction, Watts knew, but he had not seen firsthand like some of the boys were seeing, or even like Grizzly could explain to him, because Watts went to TV in Shreveport once every 2 weeks. Watts was at every Oak City and or Tulsa event every 2 weeks. And Watts got the reports from Grizzly and occasionally, obviously, was at the Superdome, but he didn't go to the Towns night. You couldn't. At that point, especially the boss wasn't going to make that fucking schedule. It was goddamn insane. So when he finally got in the ring, you could see when he got in the ring and was having to work with Dog in those matches and see it up close. And then, like you said, it wasn't a couple. He probably said something because he knew that he was having his bad habits and he was getting out of shape and etc. But it didn't dawn on him it had gone this far until in the record crowds in his entire territory, Dog just was not in any kind of good shape. But having said that, going back to New Orleans, you got to remember New Orleans was a different type of town than anywhere else in the country for wrestling. because they literally had 3 different crowds.
That's right.
In the downtown auditorium, that was a place a lot of people from the suburbs didn't want to fucking go to. It was a dangerous area. We saw the cops on horseback, dispersing the crowds from that area. It was downtown. It was tough parking, etc. It was a predominantly, middle or lower income African American, especially when Dog got hot. When he was selling that building out, it would be a predominantly black audience from inner city New Orleans. And they came week after week after week to see the Dog. And they would come by bus. There wasn't a lot of parking down there because it was downtown New Orleans, but they would come by bus or they could walk or whatever. So they're drawing thousands of people that when they would get off dates on the St. Bernard Civic Center, which was a place that seated 2,500 or so, and when they couldn't get the auditorium because it was booked or whatever, they'd go out there. That was out in St. Bernard Parish. They would draw a different type of crowd, which was more of the Cajun and just white, lower income crowd there. When they started booking shows at the UNO Lakefront Arena that was out in the suburbs, was the University of New Orleans, a beautiful 8,000 seat building. They started really running that in 84. They may have done it a time or two before, but started in 84. And we would do sometimes 5,000 or 6,000 people in that building. And not a one of them were people that were going to the matches at the downtown municipal auditorium, except for the same girls, right? Because they went everywhere. And then when they'd run the Superdome, that's when everybody would come. Everybody that came to the UNO Lakefront could go to the Superdome because the Superdome is the biggest building, nicest place in town in those days. The downtown audience could go because it was downtown. They could walk. They could take the bus. And the St. Bernard people would come because we'll drive to the Superdome, and there was plenty of parking and blah, blah, blah. So they ran New Orleans. It was a $1 million a year town. But there were several different wrestling crowds in that same city, and it depended on what building they ran as to which ones came.